This is a dry fly in the flatwing family called the Jassid. It was developed by Vince Marinaro. It's published, mimeographed, home published by Ed Story in his fly tying manual. It can be tied on 14 to 18 according to the recipe. I'll be tying it on a 14. The body will be brown dubbing. I have a brown hackle, a dry hackle feather that I'll be using to palmer over the body. And then the wing casing, the flat wing on top, is this shoulder feather from pheasant. Originally it was tied with jungle cock, but I'm not springing for jungle cock. So any feather, variegated feather or dotted feather, a starling feather would work, but you want just the small tip end of the feather. I've pulled everything off the bottom of this feather, and it's about the length of the hook shank. So I'm going to start by hardening off this feather with some thin UV resin. It's a little bit of a messy process because I need to work that resin into the feather front and back, which means I gotta grab it with my fingers. And then I guess, clean off my fingers so that I don't harden that glue onto my fingers, the resin onto my fingers. Right, and because it's a UV resin, then UV light will harden off. What do we call that? Burn it in, harden it off. I guess harden off is probably the best word, but burn it. What I want is that feather to be hard like a shell. This is really an emerger imitation. It should sit on the top of the water and act like a mayfly coming out of its pupa, or a caddis coming out of its pupa. So I'll harden that off and I'll set that feather aside. I'm using black thread, so wrap in or lay down a body of black thread on the hook shank. Take that back to the bend. Get rid of that tag. And then I have clipped the butt end of this hackle feather. It's a dry hackle feather, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sized for the hook, because we're going to do some pretty significant barbering on this. But I've clipped the butt end there to create that little barbed end, and that makes it easier to, or secure it, makes it so that I can secure that in. I am tying it with the shiny side towards me according to the instructions. And then I'm going to dub in brown dubbing. This can be tied in a variety of colors. Could be olive, any of the variety of olives, or tan, or obviously brown as I'm tying it. And it's a fairly slender, even body. So I'm going to keep that noodle tight as I wrap it. And I may want to add just a little bit more. That's probably fine. We'll put a head on the end of that, although that's quite a bit of empty shank out there yet. So if I add just a little bit more dubbing, then I'll fill up that front end a little bit better. But, you know, making sure I don't crowd that eye either. All right. So then I will take that hackle feather and I'm going to palmer it and spiral wraps around that body. And then when I get up to where I will have the head, I'm going to tie that off. First, catch it in. Clip that out. And then this is where we get a pretty severe haircut on this hackle. I'm going to trim everything on top, flat, give it a flat cut, flat top, even with the body. And then on the bottom side, I'm going to cut it at an angle. So the legs are longer in the front and angled up towards the bend of the hook. That leaves the fibers on the sides for the legs on this fly. Then I'll take that feather that I've hardened off with the UV resin, and it's going to tie in just straight on top of the fly with that stem centered. If I twist my thread counterclockwise, then it will wrap back over easily. Try to keep that so that that feather is tied in, centered on the top. I can grab that stem, pull it back, and wrap over it. That way I don't have a stem hanging out in front of the eye. And wrap the head. And then I can see if I can just snap that out. No, it doesn't want to snap. Sometimes the stem is tender enough you can just snap it out. I like to try that first. I think it gives me a cleaner look if I don't have that little white stem sticking up where I've cut it. And a whip finish, and then I'll put some head cement on that head, and of course the head cement of your choice, UV resin or whatever you prefer to use. I'm using just regular, I did use UV on the wing. I could do that also here, but I'm going to just put a dab of regular head cement. So this is a Jassid, a flatwing dry fly.